Ghost Adventures ran for 26 seasons. Zak Bagans, Goodwin, Billy Tolley, and Jay Wasley built the most successful paranormal investigation franchise in television history. They went places nobody else would go. They stayed in buildings that broke people. They documented things that the scientific community refused to acknowledge and that millions of viewers could not explain away. Then, something shifted. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but in the way that things shift in lives built around extreme work and the specific psychological toll it carries across years of sustained exposure. By the time you finish this video, you will understand what really happened to the people behind Ghost Adventures after the cameras stopped defining their days. And what you discover is going to stay with you. The full story starts right now. Ghost Adventures was never supposed to become what it became. When Zak Bagans shot the original documentary in 2004, wandering through the abandoned halls of a reportedly haunted building in Goldfield, Nevada, with a consumer camcorder and the specific kind of fearless recklessness that only comes from having nothing to lose, he was not building a franchise. He was following an obsession. The documentary that resulted from that night was raw, unpolished, and entirely unlike the produced paranormal programming that the Travel Channel and its competitors were assembling from focus group formats and talent agency rosters. It was real in the way that only footage shot by a person genuinely frightened and genuinely committed can be real. And when the Travel Channel saw it, they recognized something that no production meeting had generated and no development process had designed. They offered Bagans a series. What Ghost Adventures became across its first several seasons was something the paranormal television genre had not previously produced. Not a team of skeptics performatively debunking claims. Not a group of true believers whose enthusiasm substituted for methodology. A crew of genuine investigators whose individual relationships to the work were authentic, whose fear was real, whose connection to the locations they investigated went beyond the requirements of a production schedule, and whose chemistry as a unit created a viewing experience that no comparable show ever quite replicated. The locations they chose were not chosen for production convenience. Alcatraz, the Winchester Mystery House, Bobby Mackey's Music World, Eastern State Penitentiary, Poveglia Island, the Villisca Axe Murder House. These were places with documented histories of suffering, of violence, of deaths whose specific character the team researched and understood before they walked through the door. Zak Bagans approached every investigation as a personal mission. Goodwin brought a quality of genuine vulnerability that the audience recognized as unperformable. Billy Tolley arrived from a technical background that gave the show's equipment operation a credibility that legitimized the evidence the investigations produced. And Jay Wasley contributed an audio expertise whose professional foundation made the EVP work the show conducted more rigorous than anything comparable in the genre. Together, they produced 26 seasons of television across nearly 2 decades. The audience they built was not casual. These were viewers who watched episodes multiple times, who memorized location histories, who followed the cast members' individual lives with the kind of sustained attention that only genuine connection generates. Then the years began to show, and what they showed was not what the audience expected. Zak Bagans was born on April 3, 1977, in Washington, D.C. He grew up in Glendale, California, and later in the Detroit metropolitan area, a geography that shaped his aesthetic sensibility and his approach to darkness in ways that are visible in every creative decision he has made since. He was not a child who drifted toward the paranormal. He was drawn to it by a specific encounter he has described publicly on multiple occasions. A female apparition in the hallway of his Michigan apartment in 2002 that he has said produced in him not terror, but an absolute and consuming need to understand. That need became the engine of everything that followed. What the audience watched across 26 seasons of Ghost Adventures was Zak Bagans at the center of an investigation that was also, always, a deeply personal project. He was not a host reading scripts and hitting marks. He was a person genuinely seeking something: contact, confirmation, understanding. And the camera documented that seeking with an intimacy that the genre had not previously achieved at scale. His theatricality was real, and his fear was real, and his obsession was real. And the combination of those 3 things in a single person on camera across 2 decades produced something that no television format could have engineered deliberately. What the camera could not capture was the accumulation. 26 seasons of lockdowns in some of the most psychologically extreme environments that the concept of a haunted location has produced. Buildings where documented suffering soaked into the structure over decades or centuries. Locations associated with violence, abuse, death, and the specific residual quality that investigators believe those things leave behind. Zak Bagans spent the better part of 2 decades placing himself voluntarily into those environments, often overnight, often alone, always with the specific intention of making contact with whatever resided there. The psychological toll of that sustained exposure is not something that resolves itself between episodes. People close to Bagans have described changes that accumulated gradually and then were suddenly obvious. A withdrawal from the social ease that his earlier public persona projected, an intensity that became more consuming and less easily set aside when the production wrapped, health issues that he has addressed partially in public statements, but whose full dimension his private circle understood more completely than his audience did. His obsession with death, documented in the haunted museum he built in Las Vegas and in the artifacts of suffering he has collected across his career, moved from an investigative framework into something that began to look, to those who knew him closely, more like a compulsion whose grip had tightened across the years, rather than loosening with familiarity. By the time Ghost Adventures reached its later seasons, Zak Bagans was a different person than the 27-year-old who carried a camcorder through the Goldfield Hotel. The distance between those two versions of the same man is the part of his story that the show's episode count does not convey, and that the audience who loved what he built deserves to understand. Aaron Goodwin was born on April 1st, 1977, in Portland, Oregon. He arrived at Ghost Adventures not as a paranormal investigator with a research background, but as a cameraman whose professional skill set was in visual documentation rather than supernatural inquiry. What he brought to the show that no job description could have predicted was a quality of authentic human response to extreme situations that became one of the most beloved elements of everything Ghost Adventures produced across its run. Aaron Goodwin's fear was not performed. When he screamed, the audience knew it. When he pushed himself through a building that his entire nervous system was telling him to leave, they felt that too. His emotional transparency in environments specifically designed by the production to produce maximum psychological stress gave the show a human center that Zak Bagans' intensity and the technical crew's professional composure could not have provided without him. He was the person the audience placed themselves inside when they watched. His fear was their fear. His willingness to stay was their inspiration. What the screen did not show was what those lockdowns cost him personally. Aaron has spoken in interviews across the years about the specific psychological weight of sustained paranormal investigation, the difficulty of sleeping after certain locations, the way particular encounters stayed with him in ways that the next production day did not erase, the challenge of maintaining the boundary between professional documentation of extreme experiences and the personal residue those experiences leave in the person who underwent them. For a man whose emotional transparency was the professional attribute the show most depended on, that boundary was structurally more difficult to maintain than it would have been for a more guarded personality. His personal life carried its own weight through the years of the show's production. A marriage that ended, relationships that the demands of a production schedule whose location shooting took him away from home for sustained periods made more difficult to sustain than they might otherwise have been. Financial questions that the specific economics of television production create for crew members whose income depends on a show's continuation, and the specific challenge of building an identity so completely around a single professional context that when the framework of that context changes, the question of who you are outside of it becomes genuinely difficult to answer. Aaron Goodwin built something real on Ghost Adventures. What it took from him in the building is the chapter of his story that the laugh track of his most famous moments was always drowning out. Billy Tolley came to Ghost Adventures from a background that was genuinely unusual for paranormal television. His technical expertise in audio and visual equipment gave the show's evidence collection a professional foundation that the genre needed and rarely had, and his quiet, steady presence behind the equipment gave the investigations a grounded quality that balanced the more emotionally volatile energies that the lockdown format reliably produced. He was not the face of the show in the way that Zak and Aaron were. He was something the show arguably needed more. The person who made sure that what happened in those buildings was actually documented rather than simply experienced. What Tolley brought to the investigations beyond his technical capability was a skeptical discipline that he rarely expressed loudly, but that shaped the quality of the evidence the show took seriously. He was not a true believer whose enthusiasm preceded his analysis. He was a technician who understood what his equipment could and could not confirm, and whose professional standards for what constituted documentable evidence were higher than the production format always required him to apply. That discipline created a private friction, the distance between what his professional judgment told him about a piece of evidence and what the show's narrative required that evidence to mean, that accumulated across seasons in ways the audience was not positioned to see. The years of production work that Ghost Adventures demanded of its technical crew were not the years of a comfortable professional life. Location shooting in structures that were physically deteriorating, in environments whose conditions, Temperature, structural integrity, air quality in buildings that had been abandoned for decades created real occupational health considerations that the show's entertainment framing made easy to overlook. Billy Tolley spent years in buildings that nobody else was in, doing work that required sustained concentration in conditions that were genuinely difficult for a production whose success depended on his expertise, while its public attention centered on the personalities his equipment was documenting. What that specific professional experience produces in a person over the course of 26 seasons is a story that the technical credits at the end of every episode were never designed to tell. Jay Wasley joined the Ghost Adventures crew as its audio specialist, a role whose technical demands were specific and whose contribution to the show's most significant evidence was foundational in ways that casual viewers rarely fully appreciated. Electronic voice phenomena, the audio recordings of sounds or apparent voices captured during investigations that cannot be attributed to any present source, were among the most compelling and most debated evidence Ghost Adventures produced across its run. The quality of that evidence depended entirely on the quality of the audio documentation behind it. Jay Wasley was the person responsible for that documentation. His professional background in audio engineering gave the show's EVP work a methodological rigor that distinguished its findings from the amateur recordings that the broader paranormal community produced, and whose technical foundation made the evidence the investigations captured harder for skeptics to dismiss on purely procedural ground. What audio work in paranormal investigation produces in the person doing it is something that the field rarely discusses openly, but that practitioners acknowledge privately. The process of listening, carefully, repeatedly, with professional attention, to audio recorded in buildings associated with violence and death, at hours when the human nervous system is least equipped to process extreme sensory input calmly, across seasons of sustained overnight investigation, creates a specific kind of accumulated exposure whose effects are not captured by any episode's closing credits. Jay Wasley spent years with headphones on in dark buildings, listening for things that were not supposed to be there, and finding them often enough that the act of listening became inseparable from the expectation of what would be heard. His personal navigation of the post-production years, the transition from a professional life organized entirely around the Ghost Adventures production framework to whatever came after it, carried dimensions that the public record of his career has addressed only partially. The question of professional identity after a role that specific and that sustained is not a simple one. The skills are real. The experience is real. The resume that Ghost Adventures built for everyone on the crew is genuine. But the psychological architecture that 2 decades of paranormal investigation builds in a person does not disassemble cleanly when the production schedule ends. And the specific challenges that architecture creates in the ordinary professional world that follows it are the part of Jay Wasley's story that his audio credits never prepared the audience to understand. There is a conversation about Ghost Adventures that the show's 26 seasons of episode content was structurally incapable of having. It is the conversation about what sustained paranormal investigation at the level the show demanded does to the people conducting it, not in the sensationalized terms that the format itself sometimes deployed: possession claims, attachment theories, the suggestion that dark entities follow investigators home, but in the entirely documentable, entirely ordinary, entirely human terms of what happens to people who spend years voluntarily placing themselves in environments associated with extreme suffering and death, who do so in conditions of sleep deprivation and physical discomfort, who do so while maintaining a professional responsibility to document their responses honestly, and who do so while the commercial framework of a television production requires that those responses be compelling rather than simply truthful. Every member of the Ghost Adventures core crew has spoken at various points about the psychological cost of the work, the sleep disruption that follows certain investigations, the difficulty of returning to ordinary life after certain locations, the specific challenge of relationships maintained alongside a production schedule that takes you away from home and places you in extreme circumstances and then requires you to be present and functional for the next one. These are not supernatural claims. They are the entirely ordinary psychological consequences of extraordinary professional exposure, and they are the context without which the specific ways that each member of this cast has navigated the years since the show's peak cannot be understood. Zak Bagans built a museum dedicated to objects associated with death and suffering and spends his private hours in its company. Aaron Goodwin has navigated personal losses and relationship challenges whose specific character the production years shaped. Billy Tolley spent decades as the invisible, technical foundation of a show whose public identity never quite centered on his contribution. Jay Wasley listened for voices in the dark across seasons of investigation whose cumulative effect on a person who takes that work seriously is not a thing that resolves itself tidily. These are 4 people who gave Ghost Adventures everything it asked of them, across more seasons and more years than the genre had ever previously demanded of a stable core crew. What the show gave back, and what it could not give back, and what each of them has been navigating in its absence, is the complete story of what happened to the cast of Ghost Adventures. And it is more human, more complicated, and more heartbreaking than any episode of the show itself ever managed to be. The Zak Bagans Haunted Museum in Las Vegas is one of the most unusual institutions that paranormal television has ever produced as a cultural artifact. It is not a merchandise store. It is not a themed experience built around a show's brand for extracting secondary revenue from an established audience. It is a collection Bagans assembled over decades of personal acquisition, organized around objects he and others believe carry residual energy from the violence, suffering, and death associated with their histories. The Dybbuk Box, a staircase removed from the Demon House in Gary, Indiana, a property he purchased and demolished after documenting what he believed was an active demonic infestation. Items connected to serial killers, documented deaths, and historical tragedies whose physical residue he sought out and brought under one roof in the middle of the Las Vegas Strip. What the museum reveals about Zak Bagans at this stage of his life is more significant than anything it reveals about the objects it contains. A person who builds a structure like that and inhabits it, who surrounds himself with objects whose histories are defined entirely by suffering, who continues acquiring and engaging with that material after 26 seasons of investigation have already produced whatever answers they were going to produce, is a person in whom the original obsession has not diminished with exposure. It has deepened. The museum is an achievement. It is also a monument to something that the person who built it cannot set down. And that inability, that quality of being held by something across decades and through everything those decades produced, is the most heartbreaking element of his story, and the one his audience is least positioned to recognize as the cost that it is. Aaron Goodwin's most difficult years came not during the production of Ghost Adventures, but after it began to wind down from its peak. The professional identity he had built was so completely associated with the show, with being the person whose fear was the audience's permission to feel afraid, that the question of who Aaron Goodwin was outside that context was one he had not been given much opportunity to explore across 2 decades of continuous production. Working out the answer has been a process rather than a revelation. He has spoken about faith as an anchor through difficult periods. He has spoken about the gap between the version of yourself that a production format shapes and the person navigating ordinary life off camera. He has done all of this publicly, with the vulnerability that his Ghost Adventures persona established as his default mode of engagement, which means the people who loved him have watched his harder chapters in full view. A closeness that has been both support and pressure simultaneously. The thing about Aaron Goodwin that Ghost Adventures always communicated but never quite said is that his openness is not a performance. It is the actual texture of who he is. That quality built something rare with his audience. It also means the difficult years were not managed behind a composed public face. They were navigated honestly, in the open, in the way that someone who has never learned to be anything other than truthful navigates things. Billy Tolley and Jay Wasley occupied the position the genre produces most invisibly, the indispensable professionals whose expertise made the show's most significant evidence possible, and whose contribution the broadcast format consistently under-acknowledged. Tolley spent decades ensuring that what happened in those buildings was documented rather than simply experienced. Wasley spent years listening for things that were not supposed to be there, in conditions whose cumulative effect on a person who takes that work seriously is not something that resolves tidily when production ends. Both men built professional identities entirely inside the Ghost Adventures framework, which means the question of who they are outside that framework is the same difficult question every long-term crew member faces when the defining production of their career is finished. What the show gave back was real. What it could not give back is the version of each of them that existed before it began. The cast of Ghost Adventures is not gone. Zak Bagans continues to investigate, to acquire, to push himself into environments that most people would not enter on a dare. Aaron Goodwin continues to engage with the audience he built, with the openness that made them love him in the first place. Billy Tolley and Jay Wasley carry forward the expertise of 2 decades of work, that the genre will not see replicated at that level again. But the version of Ghost Adventures that existed in its peak seasons is finished. It finished not because of a single decision, but because of the accumulation that is the subject of this video. Because 26 seasons of extreme work in extreme environments leaves the people who do it changed in ways the production format documents only incompletely. Because the specific chemistry that made those 4 people produce what they produced cannot be refreshed indefinitely without cost. And because that cost, distributed across Zak Bagans and Aaron Goodwin and Billy Tolley and Jay Wasley in their different ways, is the real story of what happened to the cast of Ghost Adventures. It is heartbreaking because it is honest. And it is honest because these were people who were always, across 26 seasons, trying to tell the truth about what they found. If you want to stay ahead of every story like this one, subscribe now and turn your notifications on.